Fantastic. So managing your data and working on solo projects is one thing, but I'm sure that many of you have already worked on group projects. And as you progress in your career, there will almost always be some need to work collaboratively with others. And doing that is a whole new ballgame. So personally, I've worked in many group projects throughout my undergrad, postgrad, and subsequent job roles. Some have gone really well, and some have gone disastrously. And this presentation tries to capture some of those pearls of wisdom that I've gained throughout the years working on all of these different types of group projects. So just to give you a bit of an outline, in this presentation, we're going to run through some quick interactive polls, which may or may not work on top of this, we'll see in a minute, to get some ideas about your current collaborations. And then we're just going to run through the different setup steps for doing a collaborative group project. We're going to discuss the range of collaborative tools and project management tools you might wish to use to aid you with this, and finish by giving you some general tips and advice on how to best manage your data collaboratively. So I think I can actually see my polls, which is better than I thought it was going to go. So first question, which I'm just about to launch, is have you ever worked on a collaborative group project before? I'm just going to give you guys a minute or two for the results to pop through. So I don't know if you guys can see the results of this, but so far it looks like almost all of you have worked on group projects, so should have some idea of some of the things you're about to discuss. And for those of you who have been maybe lucky enough to escape that so far, I'm sure that's not going to last. So this will be useful for you moving forward in the future. So poll 2. Oh, I can share the results with you. Now, you should all be able to see the results that have come through for this poll. So poll 2. Would you say that on the collaborative projects you work with, that your research data management, your reports, your code, your data, etc., do you think that they were collaboratively managed well? So my first thing I saw was no, just massively jumping out. Oh, we've got a few yeses. Nikki, I'm hoping that's you, given that we work on some projects together. Okay, right, so just to share the results with you guys. It's a bit up and down. We've got some yeses, so clearly some of you might already be experts on collaboratively managing your research data, but we've got quite a few no's and we've got quite a few not sures. So let's move on to the next, probably most interesting poll. Have you ever encountered any of these issues during your collaborative work? So I'm not going to read all of these out, but I'm just going to give you, so please pick all of the ones that apply. And I'm just going to give you all a couple of minutes to do that, as there are quite a few things to read here. So I see that basically everything, at least some people have experienced. I mean, to be honest, if no one had answered yes to, if some of these had no yeses, I would have probably fallen off my chair. And if nobody had answered yes to any of them, that would have been absolutely shocking. So I'm gonna share the results with you guys. Right, as you can see, pretty much every single one of these items on the list, quite a lot of you have had issues with. So these are some really, really common issues in collaborative data management. Unfortunately, that no method is 100% foolproof, but we're really hoping that if you can follow some of the steps and advice from this presentation, it might at least serve to mitigate a large majority of these things from happening. So, on the note of have you ever encountered the problem of being unable to get hold of a teammate, the first thing you should do when setting up a group project is set up how you are going to communicate. Now, you might be thinking, I'm here to learn about managing my data collaboratively, and you would be right, but you will not be able to manage your data, or indeed your projects at all effectively, unless you have established methods of communication. So there are many different tools you can use for communication. So you might choose to use something like Microsoft Teams, which connects with Office 365 and it can integrate with your entire project. Or you might wish to have a separate channel for communicating. This could be through setting up a Slack or having a Facebook group or a WhatsApp group. It doesn't really matter, just whatever you prefer. But the important thing is you make a choice, you choose something, and you get it set up as soon as possible. And you exchange the appropriate contact details so that you can, in fact, all get hold of each other. So then that means if you have queries about your data, your documents, your tasks, there is always some way of communicating with each other. So step 2 is identifying the data types that you need to collaborate on. So collaborative projects, much like all projects really, can be vastly diverse. So are you collaborating on a data set or some code? Are you writing a report? Are you writing a journal paper? Are you doing potentially all of the above? This makes a really big difference. So the reason for this is that different types of data lend themselves to different collaboration tools. So if you're working on a report together, then you probably want to at least start with a collaborative editor such as Google Docs or Web 365. Similarly, if you're working with data on a spreadsheet, you might want to use Google Sheets or Excel 365. However, if you're writing a formal journal paper, then yes, you might want to start with Google Docs or Word, but you'll also then need to consider having a shared reference library, as Nikki has mentioned, and using the editor that meets your referencing requirements. You might need to submit your paper in LaTeX, in which case you might want to use Overleaf, which is a collaborative LaTeX editing tool. And if you're coding, then chances are you're going to want to set up a version control system like GitHub. So once you've established your data types, you then need to identify what collaborative tools you're going to use that best work with those data types. So why do we need to care about collaborative tools? Everyone will probably recognize a situation in the comic when you're writing a document or you're working on a data set, you need input or comments from your supervisors or collaborators, and you somehow end up with a confusing mix of documents with extended names, and you have no idea which version is which, because you've got a whole inbox full of them and emails have been sent back and forth in email chains and people have lost them and you've got confused. Now, this is not the best way to manage a collaborative project. Unfortunately, I have been in projects where it has been managed that way, but it is not the best way. If you can use some collaborative tools, you can streamline a lot of these processes. You can work on your documents and data together, and you can see what your other team members are doing. So these tools enable you to collaborate in real time, either separately or via a video call. But it is also really important to choose the tools that will work best for your project and for your group requirements, because different tools have different features and can offer different advantages. So there are different types of collaborative tools. Some offerings facilitate places just to store your data and concurrently edit it with others, such as your Office 365, Google Drive and Dropbox. And some are more specifically designed for a purpose, such as Overleaf, which is designed for collaboratively working on LaTeX documents, or reference managers, which are specifically designed to organize your references, which can either be done solo or collaboratively. And then there are version control systems like GitHub, where files can be checked out and edited by someone, and then new versions can be committed back in. So I won't focus too much on the last three, as we're going to be covering LaTeX and GitHub in our third session of the series. And obviously Nikki's just given you a wonderful talk all about reference managers. But how do we choose? So to give you a bit more information about these tools, this table shows some of the different types of data formats that you might deal with in your project and demonstrates how the different collaborative tools can handle them. So as you can see with my beautiful color key there, at least all of the systems can at least store your data. So it doesn't matter if it's Google Drive, Dropbox, Teams, GitHub, you can typically drop whatever type of file you want into the system, and at the very least it will store them. However, not all of them will enable you to edit them, and you won't always want to be able for everyone to edit them. So, it really depends. Do you want to be able to edit it? Do you want to be able to edit it in real time and collaboratively? So we're going to run through some of the different types of tools and then explain how they can be used most effectively for different types of data. So one of the sets of tools we've mentioned, namely Office 365, Google Drive and Dropbox Paper, all have a big thing in common. They're what we call WYSIWYG editors, aka what you see is what you get. And a big advantage of WYSIWYG editors is they all allow you to work on something at the same time, and you can all see what it should look like. And you can all potentially work on it from a different range of platforms if you want to. And this has become even more necessary during COVID times. I mean, back in the day of real world office, Nikki and I would sometimes sit next to each other and work on the same document on the same computer together. That, of course, has not been feasible for quite a long time. And at the moment, for a lot of us, the only way we can collaborate with somebody on a document is through a screen. So this is doubly important. And you can also all edit the same document separately throughout a day, but with track changes turned on, so you can actually see who has edited what, which can be really useful. So Office 365 is a really useful suite of tools. So all the standard, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., they're all part of this. And they can also all be used in Microsoft Teams, which allows you to create shared groups, either among your organization or between multiple organizations. You can store files in Teams, which then means everyone in that team can access them, and they can be edited collaboratively in all the different Microsoft formats. So you can work on them at the same time with your teammates. You can also sync the files to your hard drive, so you're able to edit them locally, which can be really useful. And there's also a lot of nice communication methods available via Teams. So you can use the chat to talk to your different team members, either individually or in groups. You can comment on documents, and you can start conversation threads. So for most of our audience who are at universities, students or staff at universities, you should have access to this via your institution, which means you get all of that access and all that data storage for free. Google Drive is a pretty similar offering and can be used with anyone who's got a Google account. So that uses its own native format of Google Docs, Sheets and Slides. These can, however, all be exported to the Microsoft equivalent file formats if necessary, or can be accessed and used within the web browser. They also have chat functions within documents, and you can make comments, track changes, although there isn't the facility for conversation threads in quite the same way as Teams. I mean, personally, I love Google Drive. I think it's brilliant. I have all my personal files organized in there. And I think based on using that and Office 365, it probably is slightly better for that proper hardcore real-time collaborative editing, where you absolutely both need to be able to work on it together at the same time. However, there is an issue with Google Drive, unfortunately. It's not EEA compliant, meaning that the data stored in your Google Drive is stored outside the European Economic Area, which makes it invalid for adhering to GDPR. So typically, your universities might mandate that you're not allowed to use Google Drive for certain projects, depending on where the data comes from. There can also be ethical concerns with that, which we'll touch more on in our ethics session that's in several weeks' time. But again, depending on the project and depending on the data, that's all up for negotiation. There's also Dropbox Paper. So many of you will be familiar with Dropbox, as you've potentially used it as a file sharing tool. But recently they've created Dropbox Paper for anyone who has a Dropbox account, and this allows collaborative editing of various documents. Again, like Google, it's got some of its own native formats, but there is a level of compatibility with some of the Office formats. There's also other types of collaborative tools. So I'm expecting you all to be experts by now on reference managers, having heard the last talk, so I won't go into those. There is Overleaf. So this is a collaborative LaTeX editing tool. Again, I won't go into too much detail here. You'll learn about this on the 21st, but LaTeX is a document markup language. So rather than being something that's what you see is what you get, when I type something in, Nikki can see exactly what I've intended it to be. LaTeX is a bit different. You write short snippets of code to define how your document needs to be marked up. Overleaf facilitates you doing this collaboratively, so you both can see the code that's been written and what it will then look like once you've compiled it. Similarly with GitHub, you will be learning more about this on the 21st, but this is a version control system that enables groups to collaborate and upload new versions of their code. So, taking these different types of tools into account, what are the best tools to use? If you're doing presentations or reports or journal papers, these all tend to fall into the category of data that you would typically want to collaboratively edit. So particularly in light of the current remote working situation. If you're making a presentation together or writing a report together, you are probably likely to be doing it online via a collaborative editor of sorts. Now, you could use a WYSIWYG editor such as Word or Google Docs for this, or you could use LaTeX depending on your requirements. If you're writing a report or a journal paper, sometimes you are given multiple options of how to produce this. So some journals mandate Word, some journals mandate LaTeX, and some give you a free-for-all and let you decide what you want as long as you use their templates. Obviously, if you need to submit it in LaTeX, then you can use Overleaf to do it together. And if you have to submit it in Word, use Word or Google Docs. If you need to use references, then before you make the decision, you need to check that whatever tool you're using not only works with your reference library of choice, but that your reference library of choice facilitates the format of the reference you want to use. As I said in the chat, I'm a staunch Zotero user, never want to deviate away from Zotero, but I did unfortunately have to write one paper where I could not for the life of me work out how to get the reference format to work in Zotero. So I had to pull a style file for EndNote and use EndNote for that paper, which was a distressing experience. Depending on the experience of your team, so if all of you know how to use LaTeX, happy days, you can work on that together. If only maybe one or two of you knows how to use LaTeX, then or even just depending on the timeframes you've got and how easy everybody finds it to collaborate in that kind of slightly different coding environment, it can actually be more advantageous to have all of you writing the document together in Word or Google Docs anyway. And then once you're happy with it, then somebody will translate it into LaTeX. That normally ends up being me in our team. You can also make presentations in LaTeX, which personally I think is really cool because I love LaTeX, but unless you're all LaTeX obsessed, PowerPoint is probably a more sensible option. So when it comes to data, this can get a bit more complicated. So if your data is in a standard format, aka Excel or CSV, then having it saved in OneDrive or Google Drive can be viable. But it really depends on how you're generating the data, and once it's been generated, what you're planning to do with it. So if you have a data set that you're going to use in a machine learning algorithm and you don't want that tampered with, then having it in a place where many people can access it, collaboratively edit it, and potentially even edit it by accident, maybe isn't your best plan. And if you're using it in an algorithm, then it would potentially make more sense to store it in, say, a GitHub repository alongside your code. Whereas if you're creating your data by yourselves, you're regularly editing it, you're collaborating together to produce it, then again, it's potentially better to use a tool that enables you to work on as a team. So it really just depends on what your requirements are and what that data looks like. So I'm not going to go into crazy detail about how GitHub works and how to use it, as we will be telling you about that soon. But I will say that if you are working on code, either solo or collaboratively, but especially collaboratively, you must use some sort of version control system. This is so important, and this is especially important with code, because you will almost always have multiple files, even if you're working on a small project, let alone if you move on to a large scale project. And chances are there are going to be dependencies between those files. So if you break your build with a file, you need to be able to isolate what's going on, and you need to be able to roll back to the previous working version of the relevant files. And that is really important. So media is a bit more hit and miss in terms of collaborative data management. Images and videos can be stored using any of the tools we mentioned, OneDrive, Google Drive, Teams, Dropbox. But these are not things that can or potentially should be edited collaboratively at the same time. So it is more about storing them in the most sensible place alongside the rest of your project. So for example, if you're writing a report, you'll probably have figures. So that would make sense to store the figures in a sensible file, probably called figures or images, alongside your report files, where everyone who's writing the report can access them. If you have a lot of videos, so for example, AI3SD have a lot of videos because we record all of these talks, we tend to store them with the files for each of our events, because if we're looking for things to do with our event, that's where we'd expect to find them. That was potentially quite a lot of information to take in one go. So I've condensed this down into a recommendation table. So as you've just heard, different types of data lend itself to different types of collaboration tools. You would not expect to use the same tools for managing different versions of your code, or for working on data sets, or for producing reports. And it is also about whether you want to be able to collaboratively edit in real time or not. So arguably, you don't want to collaboratively edit your code in real time with somebody else. That could lead to disaster. And there is a reason that people can check out code files via version control systems so that when they are working on them, nobody else can be. Whereas you very well might want to work on a document together at the same time. Now, you might work on a project that encompasses many of these aspects, and then you need to think about whether you want to split the data management across more than one platform, or pick the platform that works best for the project as a whole. So I don't know if Isabel is going to disapprove or potentially scalp me for this, but I personally don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with using more than one tool, as long as you talk about it properly, as long as it's minimized, and as long as you're doing it when it's necessary. For example, all your code and data over in GitHub, and maybe all your reports over in Teams or Google Docs, because those are the things that are best to work on them with. So finally, step 4, after you have gone through all of the pain to identify your data types and your tools, you now need to figure out your project management tools. So there are lots of different project management tools, but I'm just going to briefly cover 2, being Microsoft Teams and my personal favorite, Trello. So you can organize your task management in Microsoft Teams. You can create to-do lists, and you can assign different tasks to different people that are within your team. And those tasks can also be broken up into checklists if you love lists and love sub-lists like Nikki and I do. And similarly, Trello offers basically the same set of features, although a slightly different way of laying them out. You can have different boards to different projects or sub-projects, and you can assign tasks to different people or multiple people, and you can tag people in your individual checklists of tasks. They're pretty similar. It really depends on what you prefer, and there will be other tools out there that are similar, but it's mostly just you should pick one and you should use it to the best of its advantages, and also make sure that your team is happy with what you've picked. So regardless of which tools you use, there are a number of things you need to consider in order to successfully implement good project management and data management. So I'm going to go over a couple of these sort of key, top tips or considerations. Now, at the beginning, I told you cannot hope to organise your data collaboratively unless you have good communication. And similarly, you need good organisation and you need good task management for this to work. I cannot stress this enough. Being organised and communicating is half the battle. So similarly to having your data in places that everyone can access, you need to have your organisation and to-do lists in places that everyone can access. So sending tasks via emails or just agreeing them in meetings where no formal notes have been taken is a really, really bad idea, and it often doesn't work. Use a task management tool and have small, manageable tasks that are clearly assigned to team members with deadlines, and have regular meetings to discuss this and go through it. And above all, make sure you keep communicating with your team. Don't be afraid to use more than one tool. Now, I'm not saying that you should go overboard here and use multiple systems just for the sake of it and have 6 different systems implemented. However, there are some instances where this can be useful. So if you're working on a big group project, which some of you might do if you're doing masters, I certainly had to do one in my 4th year, where we had a big group project with a report, presentations, code, and data. You might then want to use a GitHub repository for your code and your data, and you might want to have something like a Microsoft Teams or a Google Drive for your reports and your documents. Like you could always then add the final copies of your reports to the GitHub repository at the end, so you do have everything all in one place. But in terms of managing them throughout the project, it might be useful to have them in a place where you can actually work on them together. The next one is to make sure you and your collaborators are comfortable using the chosen system. So you might think something is the best thing in the world. I love LaTeX. I hate writing reports in Word. I hate writing papers in Word. But I do accept that if I work with a team where nobody else likes LaTeX, it is probably sensible to say, okay, well, what's the group effort here? What does everyone want to do? What does everyone like? And you normally try and go with the tools that most people are happy to use. Another really important thing to remember is you need a clear project and document structure. Make sure you agree on a folder structure and give things sensible names. So if you can agree on this from the start, it should be easy enough for all of you to be able to navigate through the files and the data. If you're working with somebody, a good, sensible folder and file system should enable you to go find something they put in there through sheer common sense, which doesn't always work in projects, but it should, and it does make it easier to start with. If you're making lots of the same types of folder, so for example, Nikki and I collaborate on a lot of events together, so we have a template event folder that we've made that has all the subfolders of all the things we might need to create, and it also has template documents, all the different types of documents we need to create, like agendas and event materials and things to go on Eventbrite and such like. So when we create a new event, we start from that template folder and we create all of our new documents using that, which means that all of our events get created the same, whether they've been created by me or her or as a collaboration, which is then really useful when we're looking back and trying to find things. If you want to see an example of some template documents, then you can go to our website, aa3sd.org/documents, because our network template documents are up there. You need to think about access and edit permissions. Everybody who needs to be able to access the work should be able to access the work, but you don't necessarily want to give other people access. So for example, in Google Drive, you can turn on link sharing for everyone And depending on how private your data or your documents are, that might not be a good idea. You might be better off sharing it directly. It's also worth noting that there are ways you can do things so people can edit things or just see things. So you might want to show things to somebody but not permit them to edit it, depending on their role in the team. Again, I'm not going to go into crazy detail about version control systems here, but it is really important that you agree on a way of tracking your changes and dealing with version control, irrespective of the data you're using. So you can turn on track changes in your documents if you want to be able to see who has edited what. And it also enables you to all edit the document together and see what's been changed, rather than people potentially editing an offline document, emailing it around, and somebody else ending up with a different version. You can choose to manually make new versions, so such as paper version 1, paper version 2, if you've then come to a really big change. The final version is always very dangerous. If you put final on something, it's definitely not going to be your final version. But the main thing is that you need to talk about this and agree when you're moving on to a new version, and check that you've actually not left anything strange behind. And above all, make sure things are still uploaded into the same place, clearly labeled, so that everyone can actually see the progression and what's happened. So in conclusion, if you are going to successfully organise your data collaboratively, you need to communicate and you need to be organised. You need to manage your tasks sensibly and agree on who is going to do what and how you're going to collaborate. Collaboration tools can be really useful for this, so you need to identify the best ones that work with your project requirements, and sometimes you might need to use more than one. And finally, remember that data isn't just data. When we talk about collaborative research data management, this isn't just a case of dealing with CSV files or even code. It is all of the different files associated with your projects, your videos, your images, your reports, your references. It is everything that could possibly be associated with your project. And of course, just as important as the software and the tools is you and your team, because you could use the best systems in the world and still fail to collaborate. But hopefully that's not going to happen after listening to this presentation. So hopefully this has given you some ideas about how to work collaboratively and manage your data collaboratively. And now I'd be very happy to take any questions.